connected with the first stage of plants, such as herbs and seedless plants. The last stage of plants, such as palms and vines, is connected with the first stage of animals, such as snails and shellfish, which have only the power of touch. The word connection, with regard to these created things, means that the last stage of each group is fully prepared to become the first stage of the next group. The animal world then widens, its species become numerous, and in a gradual process of creation, it finally leads to man, who is able to think and to reflect. The highest stage of man is reached from the world of the monkeys, in which both sagacity and perception are found, but which has not reached the stage of actual reflection and thinking. At this point, we come to the first stage of man. This is as far as our physical observation extends. And he goes on talking about this and connecting it to the spiritual realm. In the world of creation, there are certain influences of the notions of growth and perception, etc., until he comes to say, this spiritual thing is the soul, which has perception and causes motion, and so on and so forth. My point by this is this man of science, who is actually hailed by many Western scholars and great students of the history of science as the first who has truly written a history in a way that is reflective and critical, and not only cites chronologically what happened in history, but draws the lessons sociologically, politically, psychologically, and so on and so forth. And wrote also in natural history. My point by that is that look how these two realms are talked about in an integral way, in a natural way, and in an easy way for us to appreciate without having to disconnect the spiritual from the material, but look at all of those as a continuum, as we look at the oneness of God, the affirmation of the oneness of God. We look at the affirmation of the oneness of the laws that govern this creation. Many of you should know that in the Quran, in the book of divine revelation, Muslim scholars, religious scholars, and scientists, and currently nowadays, find inspiration not only at the spiritual level, at the moral level, at the ethical level, and so on, but also for some at the scientific level. And to read in that things that, as far as we are concerned, become therefore sorts of miracles, of signs of the veracity of the word of God in this Quran. For example, God teaches in the Quran, أَوَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَيْفَ يُبْدِئُ اللَّهُ الْخَلْقَ ثُمَّ يُعِيدُهُ. This is in chapter 29, verse 19, or chapter 10, verse 4 as well. Haven't they observed how God begins creation and how thereafter he returns it? Well, how do we know how creation began? From earth. By doing what? Come on. Should know that.
Research.
Right? What type of research? Exactly, research. What type of research? That exists already, that we know?
Archaeology.
Pardon? Archaeology is one.
History.
Archaeology does not take us too far.
History.
History, true, does not take us too far. How creation was began, the process of creation itself. Geology, you're getting there.
Seasons of the year.
Pardon?
Astronomy?
Yeah, how?
Observe the same thing happening elsewhere? Or something similar or plausible to be happening elsewhere?
The first part was right. Yes, astronomy. How is that? Astronomy, by astronomy we do what? We observe into space-time. And it just happens that we know now, the further you look, you're looking into the past. You see? When we look at a star now, when we look at a star, and that star is, let's say it's 100 light years away. 100 light years away. And you're looking at a star that is 100 light years away. You know what 100 light years away, right? That's the distance light traveled at the speed of light during 100,000 years. Right? 100 light years away during 100 years. So when you're looking at a star that is 100 light years, and light travel at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second, what are you looking at actually?
100 years ago.
Exactly. You're looking at that star the way it used to be 100 years ago. In other words, assume the star dies now. Then what happens?
Will it disappear after 100 years?
We won't know for 100 years.
You will be looking at it
For 100 years.
for the next 100 years. And yet it is not there, but you're looking at it because you're looking at the past. And you go on, what about a galaxy that is 10 billion light years away? Again, we're looking at the galaxy the way it used to be around the early beginnings of the creation. Very interesting to read that verses like that. Here, search on earth, walk, and see how the world, the universe creation was begun. And then it will be returned to its original state. It will be returned to its original state. It's very interesting because scientists are doing now what? About what's the end of the universe. It's going to end either in a big crunch from the Big Bang, or it shall continue expansion forever. Is it true or false? You've heard that, you read that, right? The answer to that depends on something else, scientists say. Something called dark matter. Dark matter. What is dark matter? When scientists, in scientific ways, weigh the universe, they did put it on scale. They weighed the universe through mathematical equations, through observations, and so on. They found out that the weight of the universe or a galaxy is actually only 1 to 10% when observed to the real weight of the universe or of a galaxy. In other words, 90% of that matter, they cannot know what it is. That's they call it dark matter. There are only speculations so far as to what it is. Only then, if we have the answer to that question, then they would know whether the universe most likely will come back through a big crunch or it continues forever expanding. From this verse, Muslims would tend to believe which alternative, if you know these meanings in science, the first alternative, through a big crunch. And that's so far what most of the scientists are speculating, but there is no definitive evidence for that. The Quran teaches, interestingly also, in chapter 51, verse 47, وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. God speaks of the heavens, space-time, and says, and we are expanding them. Exact word used, and we are expanding them. Every basic student of physics knows that in physics we are learning as a fact the concept of what? Of the expansion of the universe. From the Big Bang, when the universe was all in that singularity, and suddenly an explosion of matter and energy of space and time, not an explosion into space or into time. Remember, we said earlier, at that point there was no space and there was no time. So it's an explosion into space, an explosion of space and of time. And then from then on, there is the expansion. By the way, the expansion where? You're smiling because that's the right reaction. Because remember, beyond is undefined. There is no space. There is no time. It's amazing. That's what science says. This is not religious words. This is what science says. Beyond, it's not an expansion into space or into time. I'm sorry, into space or into time, but it's an explosion of space and of time. What are the boundaries of this universe as it expands? The question doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because we don't know the answers. And the Quran teaches that the universe is expanding and that actually it started at a breakup point. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. You can read that in chapter 21, verse 30, when God teaches us that space-time, matter, the universes, earth, all of it was one thing. Ratqa, strongly held together. And then we cause them to break asunder. This is a breakage that is violent, powerful. And that's what we call, we believe, in current modern science, what? The Big Bang. And so on. We can go on and on through this to elucidate, in addition to what we said, that in Islam the concept of science and Islam find a very easy way of reconciliation. I should even call it reconciliation. I think both science and religion in Islam are two sides of the same coin. And thus, I find myself, both as a scientist and as a person of religion, very easy and very comfortable in my life. As I read science, or I studied science, or as I read religion, and I study religion, and I practice religion spiritually, I find myself more and more in unison with nature and the laws of nature, because everything with me is celebrating and glorifying the name of God. When we go to the level of embryology, we find extreme, very, very interesting thing also in the Quran. Since time does not permit me to say a lot more, I'm going to, in that regard, for example, just read to you a quote from a book on embryology that was used for first-year UCLA students, University of California, Los Angeles. Some of you might have had the chance to read some of those excerpts. And the author, excuse me, Professor Moore, says, it is cited in the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, that human beings are produced from a mixture of secretions from the male and the female. Several references are made to the creation of the human being from a sperm drop, and it is also suggested that the resulting organisms settle in the woman like a seed. This is in the Sunnah, this next one, not in the Quran, 6 days after its beginning. The human blastocyst begins to implant about 6 days after fertilization. The Quran also states that the sperm drop develops into a clot of congealed blood. An implanted blastocyst or a spontaneously aborted conceptus would resemble a blood clot. Reference is also made to the leech-like appearance of the embryo, and so on. All of this from the Quran are facts, become facts, are facts in embryology, which Professor Moore, in his book, that is from which these paragraphs are quoted, is the book which was at the year of this article, current embryology textbook for the first year class at UCLA Medical School. And in the light of 14 centuries ago, that would have been impossible for a man to know those details. The concept of, again, what is the origin of the human being? In Islam, the Quran teaches us in many verses. One of the verses teaches, and we need to take all of those verses together to have a compound idea of what the Quran teaches us of the origin of man. In that verse, it teaches, as some of you know as Muslims, that God created the human being from clay or mud, even stinking mud. And through developmental stages became who he became. Because God says, and we created you in stages. And those stages are true embryologically, we know that. Before this, or during the revelation of the Quran, the common view in the world and amongst philosophers and scientists of those days, until basically the 18th century, the Aristotle's notion of how a child came to existence, as some of you should know, is that the human being is fully formed as a minuscule human in the semen of the male. Did you know that? Yeah. In the semen of the male, and that the presence of the semen in the mother's womb simply fertilizes that and feeds it, and it keeps growing. Or the other view was that actually the human being comes fully formed from the blood of the menstruation of the woman, and that the semen of the male simply is a catalyst and fertilizer. It helps it grow. This is the view up to the 18th century. The Quran spoke of the embryological stages as we know them now in modern times. And that's something very fascinating, very interesting. Again, showing what I started early in the beginning, this integration, this continuum between rational and supra-rational, between the matter and the spirit, between religion and science. And therefore you find, and I'm going to quickly close with this, and if you want I can go on 2 hours, but I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to be as brief as I can. And therefore you have found Muslim scientists who are profoundly religious also, as I mentioned, and who have made great contributions to the history of science. Muslims, after the coming of Islam, after the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, may God's peace be with him and upon all the messengers, and he taught human beings the word of God that contained some of the things I mentioned to you. The world changed, and the Arabs changed, and the world changed. And Muslims also took from the existing legacy of human civilizations before. They translated the great works in the medieval times. We're talking about the 8th century, 7th, 8th century, 9th century, 8th, 9th, 10th century. 8th century mostly had translated the great works of previous civilizations, the Greeks, the Persians, the Hindus, and then enriched humanity through this powerful drive in Islam of the integration between the rational and the supra-rational, between the material and the spiritual, and therefore produced great strides of science. And it is upon the shoulders of those Muslim medieval scientists that the Western modern civilization was built, as many current modern historians have also told us. So, coupled with all this exposure to the Greek and Hindu and Persian knowledge, and the principles that I mentioned to you from Islamic teachings, that gave rise to a galaxy of Muslim luminaries in the fields of all scientific disciplines known to man at that time. Their works circulated in Europe and were translated into Latin and other European languages. For example, Ibn Nafis, centuries before William Harvey, described the blood circulation. Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Azan, as known in the West, of the 10th century, also centuries before Newton, described the refraction of light and believed in the principle of least time, those of you who studied some classical optics. Al-Khazini, centuries before Torricelli, Torricelli, knew the density of air, and before Newton had already talked about the law of gravity. Al-Battani and Al-Farghani of the 10th century, and Al-Fazani and Al-Biruni and As-Sijzi before Copernicus and Galileo entertained the scientific deep debate about the nature of our planetary system, whether geocentric or heliocentric. By the way, is it geocentric or heliocentric?
Heliocentric.
Good. Just so you know the difference. Earth is not anymore the center of the universe. To the extent, listen to this, that As-Sijzi believed that our planetary system is heliocentric. And that's the view he favored, and he even built an astrolabe based on this view in the 10th century. Ibn al-Haytham and al-Biruni, when it came to the scientific method of research, were the ones upon whose shoulders Roger Bacon stood, as some have put it. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name brought to us the term, which term?
Algorithm.
Algorithm. The word algorithm, you have used it. That's an Arabic word, which is actually simply a mutilated way to say Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizm, Al-Gawarizm, Al-Gawarizm, until it became Garithm, until it became algorithm. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name brought to us the term algorithm, and whose genius created algebra, the name or the word he used for his treatise in Arabic called Al-Jabr. Al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. He's the first one who invented algebra and how to solve algebraic equations of one variable and two variables and so on. And the way his method of putting the variables aside and the constants aside, that's called Al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. Al-Jabr became algebra. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, and Ibn Rushd were the most celebrated physicians in the West. Their works, not only in medicine, but in philosophy and rationalistic thinking, had great influence in Europe. And as I mentioned, Ibn Khaldun of the 14th century gained his fame for his works in sociology and natural history. And thus we see this conflict between religion and science in Islam, and some of which, unfortunately, or most of which, unfortunately, is unknown to most. Only very special students of knowledge and of the science of history would know these things. Even Muslims sometimes, in their own countries, in their own environments, are unaware of these facts, and thus unaware of the symbiosis that exists Islamically between science and religion, between true science and true religion, not scientific dogmatism, nor religious dogmatism. Sometimes, or rather, we should always require from science to give us the scientific facts, not to dogmatize science for us. religiously. We should ask religious people also to tell us the facts of religion, rather than to dogmatize for us religion. And in that way, I think we would be all better off. And in that way, I think a greater appreciation generally of the religion of Islam is reached, and that bridges between the world of the rational and the world of science, I think, and the world of science, yes, is most beautifully attained through realizing what Islam historically had of relationship with the rational and with the scientific, and the contribution of the Muslim scientists to human civilization, and thereby I think many of the fears, many of the misconceptions that we have about Islam as Muslims and as non-Muslims would, I think, disappear, and would help us build cleaner bridges and stronger bridges towards a brighter future. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khairan, Mokhtar. And before we conclude, I'm going to open the door for any questions. Yeah.
With your last point you made, could you just briefly contrast between facts and dogmatism? Just for those of us who aren't clear of this.
Yeah, thank you. I mean by that between, for example, scientific facts and some personal, philosophical, or cultural interpretations of those facts. For example, let's take an example of medieval times. Even when the notion was wrong that the Earth was the center of the universe, and it was quote-unquote scientifically held so, it didn't have to be dogmatized. And how was it dogmatized, do you know? Religiously.
Religiously, did it have to do with certain interpretations
Yes.
of scriptures in the Bible?
For example, or not even that, but rather that the Earth being the center of the universe is a good thing to have religiously. Why? Because that would explain, not rationally, but simply emotionally, that we are at the center of concern of the divine. We are the center of the universe, so we are really under the gaze of the divine, and God is looking at us. But if we are just one of the specks of dust in the universe, we're not the center of the universe, to them, that's dogmatism, then we're not anymore at the center of attention of the divine. No, it doesn't have to be that way. That the center of the universe being Earth, and therefore we are at the center of attention of the divine, and if we're not anymore. But that's dogmatism. Another example. You know, the fact that when it comes to the origin of life, what's the origin of life? And then we go back and back and back and back until a point, then, you know, the DNA, where did it come from? And this ordered pattern of information, this extreme aura, this extreme intelligence there, where did it come from? But dogmatizing science here is interpreting it by saying, you see, well, it came spontaneously. We don't have to introduce the agency of God to explain the origin of these things. God does not exist, or some say we don't have to introduce the agency of God in explaining the origin of life, because the origin of life is because of the spontaneous coming together of organic matter, made even of protein, from certain conditions that prevailed at that time. Despite the fact that it violates the second law of thermodynamics. Are you following me? Despite the fact that it violates the second law of thermodynamics, because the second law of thermodynamics teaches that you cannot have order in a closed system from disorder, never, until you introduce an external force to the system to order the disorder, to make order in the disorder. So to say that in this open universe of ours, which is closed after all, beyond the universe there is nothing, quote unquote, that this disorder, lifelessness, no life existed as disorder, you were not ordered in a living way, suddenly comes spontaneously because of the passage of time. That's a violation of second law of thermodynamics and the law of entropy. And thus to say, they forget this violation of the second law of thermodynamics and then says it came spontaneously. We do not have to postulate an external agency, divine, that produced that order. And I think that's dogmatism. Science only tells us, should tell us, these are the facts. This is what happened. Don't go beyond that. Also religion, as I gave the other example, tell us the facts. Don't make your interpretations as reality. They might be true, they might be false. Don't dogmatize and present dogmatism as fact. Present the facts as facts, and dogmatism as dogmatism. Or interpretations as interpretations. Don't give me an interpretation and give it the garb of science. Right? Don't give me a personal spiritual experience and give it the garb of the divine. Same thing. That's religious dogmatism. Are you with me? Don't give me a personal religious experience, spiritual religious experience, and give it the garb of, I was inspired by God. God spoke to me. For example, tell me what you experienced and your interpretation, but don't make it a religious fact. On the other side, give me scientific facts and don't mix them with your interpretations until your interpretations become facts to me or to the uninitiated. That's what I meant. Does it help? Some. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Salam. Yes, I did mention that earlier, the Big Bang Theory and the verse that I quoted to you, and I gave you the verse number in the Quran, in Surah Al-Anbiya, that God spoke of that concept. Haven't they observed that the heavens and earth were ratqan, clothed together, clothed together. فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. Fataqa in the Arabic language means to break violently, strongly. فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. And broke them asunder. That's what we believe would probably allude to the concept of the scientific fact of the Big Bang. I'm talking the scientific fact of the Big Bang, but the details of the Big Bang keep on, sometimes some of the details are modified. When they added the concept of inflation in the Big Bang theory. It's not that the Big Bang is not true, but it was not complete. The Big Bang existed, but something else that happened in the earliest stages of that Big Bang called inflation that must be added to that concept to have a better and a more accurate theory of that Big Bang explosion. And then I connected that to the text that teaches in the Quran that the universe is expanding. Actually, at the time you're reading the Quran, at the time the Quran was revealed, at the time you're reading it, because the grammatical usage in that verse is a progressive form. وَإِنَّا لَمُرْسِلُونَ. And we are surely expanding. It means 14 centuries, and now as you are reading it, it is taking place, which I find fascinating. and the usage of languages is very, very important. The understanding of it is very important to understand, I think, some of the nuances and the specifics that are mentioned in the Quran. Any other question? I think you're hungry. That's why you don't ask any question. That's matter. And now let's go to the material. Enough of the intellectual and the spiritual, and let's integrate with the material so that we practically show how Islam integrates food of the body and food of the spirit. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.